In 1999, the New York Times published the obituary of Ann Miller. Ann was 90 years old, was a graduate of the Columbia Presbyterian School of Nursing, and was survived by 3 sons, 6 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren. She had a long and full life, the kind that each of us might aspire to. In order to understand what makes Ann so special, though, I need to take you back to 1942. In March of that year, Ann was suffering from a bacterial infection. She was delirious. She had a fever of nearly 107 degrees. In fact, she was on the brink of death. Her doctors had tried everything: sulfa drugs, blood transfusions, everything they could think of, but nothing seemed to help. Fortunately for Ann, she then received an injection of an investigational drug. By the very next day, her fever had dropped considerably, she was no longer delirious, and she was able to eat full meals again. And she went on to live another 57 years. This is the amazing power of antibiotics. I'd like to introduce you now to another patient, this time a 2-year-old boy from Chicago named Simon. Simon also had an infection, this time from methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA. And unfortunately for Simon, drugs like penicillin don't work for MRSA. Sadly, he succumbed to his infection and passed away at the age of 2. This illustrates the threat of antibiotic resistance. In fact, some experts fear that we might be approaching a so-called post-antibiotic era, an era in which these life-saving medicines may no longer be effective, and in which deaths from infections might become increasingly commonplace. My research is dedicated to finding new antibiotics that will be effective against these antibiotic-resistant infections like MRSA. To help get you started in understanding our research, I'd like to talk a little bit about bacteria, about how antibiotics work, and about where resistance comes from in the first place. So here's an image of MRSA. You can see these tiny little spherical cells. In fact, those MRSA cells are about 1/1,000,000th the size of you and me. It's amazing to think that something so small could be so dangerous. On the next slide is another bacterium called Ecoli. And I've shown this to show the bacterial cell and to highlight that the bacterial cell is surrounded by a so-called cell wall. You can think of the cell wall like a water balloon. It's essentially what keeps the insides in. So now imagine what would happen if you damaged the surface of that balloon. This is what penicillin does. Penicillin interferes with the synthesis of the cell wall, and in doing so, the bacterial cells explode, just like a water balloon might pop. If you were to take a look inside that water balloon, though, you'd find a lot more than just water in there. For example, bacteria have these amazing factories called ribosomes where they manufacture their proteins. Bacteria need proteins just like you and I. And you can see this wonderful complex structure on the screen. Drugs like Z-Pak work by inhibiting the bacterial ribosome. One last mechanism I'd like to talk about today is DNA. Bacteria, just like you and I, use DNA to carry their genetic information. There's a couple special things about bacteria, though. One, we talked about their size. Another is that they double extremely quickly. E. coli, for example, replicates every 30 minutes or so. In addition, there's a lot of DNA in a bacterial cell. If you were to stretch out the DNA of E. coli next to the cell, it would be 1,000 times the length of that cell. Now, given how important DNA is, given how quickly bacteria replicate, you can imagine that that DNA is not just stuffed into the cell like a sleeping bag into a stuff sack. It needs to be packaged carefully. It needs to be able to be accessed readily and efficiently and effectively in order for bacteria to survive. So there are drugs that also interfere with this process. But to get started on that, I need to introduce you to my office telephone. So my office telephone has a traditional phone cord. And you can think of the spiral of that cord like the double helix of DNA. But you'll also note that that cord is folded over upon itself several times. That's a phenomenon that also happens with DNA. It's a phenomenon called supercoiling. And you can see that the cord is more compact when that supercoiling occurs. That's the same thing that happens with DNA. Now, if you've ever tried to untangle your iPhone earbuds, you probably know that it's difficult to untangle these things. So bacteria have specialized DNA untangling enzymes called topoisomerases, and I've shown one of them on this screen. So in the silver color is an enzyme called a topoisomerase. In the blue is a bacterial strand of DNA. And these topoisomerases effectively untangle DNA by relaxing supercoils. Now, there are drugs that interfere with this process. In fact, if we zoom in on the very middle of that picture I showed you earlier, highlighted in the circle is a drug called Cipro. Cipro interferes with bacterial topoisomerases. In doing so, bacteria accumulate damage to their DNA, and that kills the bacteria. Now, Cipro fits into this topoisomerase very snugly. You can think of it just like a key fitting into a lock. Very good fit. Okay, so now we've talked about some of the common mechanisms of antibiotics. Where is it that resistance comes from? There are many different possible mechanisms, but one of them is called mutation. And you can think of mutation as the bacteria's way of changing the lock. So I talked about Cipro fitting into a topoisomerase just like a key in a lock. Well, if the structure of that lock has changed, the key no longer fits, the drug no longer works, and the bacteria survive. It's resistance mechanisms like this that have created the antibiotic resistance crisis. And we're aiming to contribute to solving that through the discovery of a new generation of antibiotics. Our approach is to design a new set of master keys, keys that fit both the original lock as well as that mutant lock so that we can treat infections from antibiotic-resistant bacteria. We're part of a number of researchers all around the world who are investigating a new set of therapies called novel bacterial topoisomerase inhibitors, or NBTIs. This work has been ongoing for about 20 years in companies and academic laboratories around the world. On this slide, I've shown you the chemical structure on the right of one of the typical NBTIs. Scientists at GSK, a company, developed this particular compound. And on the other side of the slide, you can see exactly how this compound binds to the bacterial topoisomerase. So the black structure on the one side is the same as the yellow structure in the middle of the other. And at the top of the slide, you can see some green and blue. That's bacterial DNA. And you can see that the top portion of the NBTI essentially slides in between the bacterial DNA. At the bottom of the structure is a pocket. You can think of it like the pocket in your jeans. And a portion of the NBTI, the bottom portion of that molecule, slides right into that pocket. It fits, again, almost like a key in a lock. These compounds are incredibly effective against antibiotic-resistant bacteria like MRSA. So it's a pretty exciting breakthrough and one that we're really excited to be a part of. But I told you that people have been working on this for 20 years. That's probably pretty shocking for you. So why is it that it has taken so long and that we don't yet have therapies in the hands of physicians from this exciting new class? And a key issue is safety. So when you develop new medicines, not only do they need to be effective, in this case effective against antibiotic-resistant bacteria, they also need to be safe. Safety comes in many forms. The NBTIs, though, have been associated with a problem in potassium handling. So you all have potassium in your diet. Maybe you, like me, had a banana this morning. And potassium plays a number of roles inside your body. One of them is in regulating your heartbeat. Potassium ions flow out of your cardiac muscle, and in doing so, they help keep your heartbeat regular. And some drugs interfere with a channel through which those potassium ions flow, a channel called hERG. And the NBTIs have been observed to do this. In fact, it's the center portion of this molecule that seems to drive that interaction with the potassium channel. Specifically, the nitrogen atom that's the letter N on this slide. So we want to design drugs that reduce this interaction so that we don't disrupt potassium handling so that you have a nice regular heartbeat. How do we do that? So we do this, one strategy is a very, very simple molecular change. In the green circle, I've shown one of our molecules in which we've inserted 2 oxygen atoms into the central portion of that molecule. Those oxygen atoms are the letters O. Those oxygens reduce the interaction of the nitrogen with that potassium channel. You can think of it like 2 friends holding back a buddy from a fight. And in doing so, this actually has a rather dramatic impact on safety. Our compounds are as much as 20-fold safer than ones that had been previously discovered. So we've made great progress on that front. One other question you might be asking yourselves, though, is why won't bacteria just develop resistance to these new compounds? Why won't they mutate the lock and prevent the binding of the master keys that we're developing, just like before? And we have a strategy for this, too. On the screen, you can see there are actually 2 locks. Most bacteria have 2 topoisomerases. And our strategy is to design a set of master keys that not only fit the first lock, but also fit the second lock, such that even a mutation in the first, even if the locksmith comes along and changes the first lock, will still bind to the second and be able to kill the bacteria. So I'm really happy today to talk to you about our research, which is dedicated to finding new antibiotics for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. It's our hope that patients like Ann Miller will always have access to safe, effective, life-saving medicines. Thank you.